much for joining us at the next of our CX webinar program, looking at creating an AI strategy for your organization. I can see we have a few people continuing to join the room, but we're 2 minutes past the hour, so we will make a start. My name is Simon Elliott. I'm a partner with Dentons in our London office, and I head our UK, Ireland, Middle East data and cyber team, and along with my colleagues Jianji and Peter, co-lead our global AI initiatives. And we're delighted that you've been able to join us for this CX webinar today. I'll ask my fantastic co-speakers to introduce themselves in just a moment or two, but I'll just take a second just to set a little bit of context for what we're going to be covering in the session today. I was just looking back this morning and last night at when we last ran an AI seminar as part of the CX webinar series, and it felt like a long time ago because everything feels like a long time and anything to do with AI. But it was actually only back in February this year. ChatGPT had only been launched a couple of months, and already there was huge excitement around the possibilities of this technology. That felt like a very opportune moment to be running an AI seminar. But if anything, today and now is almost an even more important time to be talking about how to successfully deploy AI within businesses. I think literally every day at the minute, there's a headline in the news looking at either the risks or the potential opportunities around AI, whether that's concern around the risk of disinformation impacting on the elections next year, during which some 4 billion people across the world will choose their leaders, or the opportunities of working at factory efficiencies, work-life balances, or major developments in education as well. There's been lots of focus on boardroom machinations at OpenAI and Microsoft recently. World leaders have been coming together in the UK and at G7 to look at major initiatives, and there has been a lot happening on the legislative and regulatory front at the minute. So we know that now is a very opportune time to be having this discussion. It's now also the time that C-suite and executive leaders are looking very seriously at how they can make sure they're using AI in their businesses, or the competitive advantage they're missing if they're not using that. We also know there are a lot of discussions, publications, and panels that look at AI, and perhaps some of them are not quite as concrete on the detail in relation to giving actionable insights as to how to go about managing this. So our challenge today is to try and fill in that gap, to put a bit of flesh on the bones in relation to how to strategize, deploy, and manage AI within your system. We'll be giving you our shared insight from advice that we're giving on clients, working expert groups that we're part of, or discussions that we have with contacts and clients. But this is a learning experience for everyone. I think across the board, one of the key things that comes through from any discussions is that the rate of development, both from a technology perspective and a governance perspective, is phenomenal in this space. This really is the sort of the key example of trying to build the plane while you're flying it. And what we aim to do at the very least is to give you the initial blueprint for how to do that within your organization. So with that, I'll ask my speakers to briefly introduce themselves. I'm going to go to the furthest west to start with, our colleague right the way over in San Diego. Peter, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon. Good morning, everyone from California. My name is Peter Stockberger. I'm a partner in our Venture Technology and Emerging Growths Companies group, where I focus on data privacy, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. As Simon mentioned, I work closely with Simon and Jianji on co-leading our global AI efforts. I also co-lead our global autonomous vehicles group. So I've been working with companies for years now on artificial intelligence and AI governance. So very much looking forward to the discussion and adding the US viewpoint on all things AI.
Thanks, Peter. Moving over to London, I'll ask Dr. Hon if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kwan Hon with the Privacy and Cybersecurity Group in London. I have degrees in computing science, including AI, as well as law. And as beyond working on privacy and security, of course, we are all expanding our work into AI and tech regulation.
Thanks, Kwan. I'm moving to our colleagues in Italy. Chiara.
Thanks, Simon, and welcome, everyone. I'm Chiara Bocchi. I'm a counsel working in the TMT department of Dentons Milan. And my daily activities range from data protection to commercial contracts. And together with Gian Giacomo, we are also assisting clients in their compliance journeys with AI solutions, including innovation governance strategies.
Thanks, Chiara. Jianji.
Well, and Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Very exciting times in Europe, in the sense we are really hoping that with the next trilogue we will be having which will be held in December, we'll be having the new AI Act formally agreed. So what do we do in Europe together with the rest of the team? We deal a lot with data, we deal a lot with privacy, with technology, and obviously with AI, assisting both companies as well as public institutions, including advising recently on government commission with regards to the AI strategy. So very exciting times, as I say, and thank you.
Thanks, Jianji. We really couldn't have a better expert panels to be able to speak to you today. So we can just move on. We'll very quickly just touch on what we're going to be covering in the next hour. So we will give you some short to the point updates. I think anyone who's sort of active in this space realizes there's been a lot going on, even just in the last couple of months, in terms of development. So we know it's difficult to keep across all of those. We want to give you the key takeaways on some important legislative and regulatory developments. We'll then get into the real meat of the session. Myself, Peter, and Jianji will look at what we see as the cornerstones of any AI governance program. We'll reinforce that with some takeaways. We'll touch on a couple of wider AI resources that you can access through your contacts at Dentons, and fingers crossed, if we have a little bit of time, we'll allow for some Q&A. Please do, however, feel free to use the chat function as we go through to pick up or to ask any questions. If we have time at the end, we'll cover those. Otherwise, we will definitely make a point of getting back in touch to follow up on any questions. Now, just before we dive into the content, we do have throughout the session a couple of quick polls just to get a bit of sense of where the market is, to allow you to benchmark your efforts as an organization. And we'll deal with the first one of those now. So this question is looking at what stages of your governance and development and maturity is your business at within AI, in relation to AI currently. And we're trying to cover the range here, either from a very early stage process where really we know we need to use it, but we're not quite sure where or how, to those that have perhaps looked at a bit more of an evolved framework or governance structure. Perhaps there's an AI council or board in place, or at least some policies or procedures in place. Please feel free to add in your answers at the minute. I can see we've had a very good response rate already. We'll just allow just another 5 seconds or so for people to respond. Keen to get on to the content of our session, but I think this is an important checkpoint for lots of people. So just the last few seconds, and then we'll show the poll. Great, Niamh, if you're able to throw up the results. Thank you very much. So yeah, interestingly, about half of our attendees are still very early stage in the process. So hopefully lots of learnings from this session. Although interesting to see about a quarter have developed some sort of technical standards or some sort of internal procedures. Some within a function, 10% have sort of identified that need for a dedicated function, which is an interesting amount. So, but I think reflective of what we're seeing at the market at the minute, so very early stage at the minute. Okay, if we can move on to that now. As I say, we'll give a quick update in relation to some key regulatory developments, many coming from the US, particularly important in a minute. So I'll hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Simon. If we can go to the next slide, please. You know, from a US perspective, we've obviously had a lot of developments in AI regulation in the past several weeks. Most notably, the White House released an executive order on October 30th, addressing AI usage across industry, across the federal government. And that's probably the most significant development we've had in the US for the past several years. But when you're thinking about US regulatory developments, the White House's efforts are an important component of it. It's sort of one stone. The other stone is federal legislation. So we have the US House and Senate working on AI. And then we have issues at the local level, state and local level. So I'll break those three down for you in terms of what's happening at each level. Right now, we do not have a federal AI law that governs all 50 states. So we're very much in the same space as we are in data privacy. It's becoming a patchwork of federal executive orders, agency decisions, and state and local decisions. We do have a couple of federal bills that have been introduced that are bipartisan to address AI. One is a proposal for a licensing regime at the federal level to license large developers of AI. There's another bipartisan proposal that looks more like the EU AI Act in terms of having a risk-based assessment of AI. Nothing quite concrete yet at the federal legislative level, and with a presidential election coming next year, I'm not holding my breath for any developments there until after the election. However, we are seeing much more development at the federal executive branch level. So this is where the White House issues policy statements, executive orders that govern all federal agencies that sit under the White House. And that's exactly what the White House did on October 30th when they released their executive order on safe and ethical artificial intelligence. Now, what this executive order does is it's a statement of policy, a directive from the president to all federal agencies that fall under his authority to take certain action. And so when you read the executive order, which is about 111 pages, it's filled with directives to different federal agencies to take action. So for example, it directs the U.S. Department of Commerce, who underneath the U.S. Department of Commerce, there's the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST. So it directs NIST through the Department of Commerce to take certain steps to develop further guidelines to help private and public industry figure out how to manage AI risk. And this really complements what NIST released in January of this year, which was the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, which is a fairly significant risk management framework that NIST released. NIST is often in the business of releasing these risk management frameworks in different spaces. Many of you have probably heard of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which was released in 2014, gives a perfect view on how to manage cybersecurity risk. They also released a privacy risk framework. Now they have an AI risk management framework. So the executive order directed NIST to continue on that trajectory in developing standards. The executive order also directed the Department of Commerce to work internationally with international standards organizations, the EU, other groups, to develop international technical standards or to further that discussion for AI. In terms of the private industry, though, it does have limited application, and that's because executive orders, by nature of US law, are not binding law on the private space. They're really a directive to federal agencies. So where this executive order impacts, I would say, private organizations is that, one, it does impact developers of AI and developers of large language models because it specifically calls out the enforcement or the triggering of the Defense Production Act, which is an old wartime law that allows the federal government to basically commandeer production of a certain industry in an effort to promote national security. And this executive order specifically requires certain developers of certain size AIs to report on their testing, red team testing, their vulnerability scans, and their training to the US government, both through the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce. So it does impact some developers in the AI space. It also calls on the Department of Health and Human Services, which governs healthcare law in the US federally, to work with the private sector in the healthcare space to develop specific standards. So bottom line is it's a sweeping executive order. It calls on a number of agencies to take action early next year in 2024. So we're going to see more come out in this space. And it does encourage other agencies like the Department of Justice, like the EEOC, to further develop responsible uses of AI. That's at the federal level. At the state and local level, I think that's where we're going to see even more activity. We have states like California just yesterday released new draft regulations on automated decision-making, very extensive regulations requiring notice, requiring consent, requiring people to opt out of automated decision-making. So first of its kind regulation at the state level. And we're going to further see lawsuits. Everyone on the US side, we're a bit of a litigious society. So the lawsuits are starting to grow, and we're seeing lawsuits relating to copyright infringement against large language models, privacy violations. The FTC is opening an investigation. So I think in terms of looking back at it from a 10,000-foot level, we're going to continue to see activity at the federal level, most likely continuing to come out of the White House. We're going to see even more activity at the state and local level, which will make it a more complicated patchwork. And we'll continue to see plaintiffs and law firms push the envelope on both developers and deployers of AI. So Simon, a bit of a complicated picture in the US, but nothing out of the normal for US law. But with that, Chiara, I'll toss it over to you to talk about what's happening in the EU, because as I understand it, there's some complicated discussions at the EU level as well.
Yes, Peter, thank you. And you are absolutely right. We can skip to the next slide to see what is happening now at the EU level. No, the previous one. Thank you. So discussions on the AI Act are still ongoing. The draft AI Act, the first European attempt to rule AI, was first released in April 2021. The approach taken by the EU Commission is a risk-based approach. In a few words, the higher the risk, the stricter the requirements. In the very first draft, 4 categories of AI systems were provided. Almost all the rules of the AI Act were addressed to high-risk AI systems. High-risk AI systems are indeed permitted, but subject to compliance with strict requirements, including risk assessment, risk management, data quality, data governance, and monitoring obligations. Limited risk AI systems and lower minimum risk AI systems are permitted as well, subject to a few transparency and information obligations. Basically, it has to be made clear to the individuals that they are interacting with an AI system and not with a human being. But after the rise of ChatGPT, discussions on the AI Act became more heated as institutions started wondering how to ensure that such kind of AI systems are covered by the AI Act. Foundation models, generative AI systems, general purpose AI systems, they can all be used for a variety of purposes. And in case such purposes become high risk after the system is put in the market, the burden of ensuring compliance with the rules applicable to high-risk AI systems lies on the user or on the deployer based on the definition that will be chosen. But the deployer may not be in the position to ensure timely compliance, and these would entail risks for the individuals, basically the same risks that the AI Act wants to prevent. The strategy chosen by the EU institutions is to provide for the application of at least certain rules for high-risk AI systems, also to foundation models. The discussions are taking longer than expected, as no agreement has been reached yet on which rules, on how to identify and define foundation models, and on how to distinguish between the various categories of AI systems, which is quite important as obligations may vary also significantly among the different categories. Other open points of discussion concern the definition of AI, the list of banned AI systems, the ones that carry an unacceptable risk, and the introduction of a fundamental rights impact assessment, which would be in addition to the data protection impact assessment provided by the GDPR. And lately, France, Germany, and Italy were reported to have proposed to rule foundation models based on codes of conduct without an initial sanction regime. In terms of next steps, on the 6th of December, as Gian Giacomo noted at the beginning of our meeting, there will be the next and maybe last trialogue between the EU institutions, as EU institutions are expected to reach in that occasion a political agreement on the AI Act. If no agreement is reached in December, in light of the parliament elections of next June, the AI Act could be at risk of not being finalized soon. And if so, the EU could clearly lose ground compared to the other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. The EU is working also on an AI liability directive. In the European Commission's view, the AI Act and the AI liability directive complement and reinforce each other. The AI Act provides for safety rules aimed at reducing risks and preventing damages. But as risks cannot be eliminated completely, liability rules shall ensure that individuals can obtain effective compensation in the event of damage caused by AI systems, and these rules are those of the AI Liability Directive. In a few words, AI systems are opaque, they are complex, they are autonomous, And all these features make it extremely difficult for the victims of damages caused by AI to meet the burden of proving the fault, the damage, and the causal link between the fault and the damage. This new directive tries to support the victims by introducing two main measures: rebuttable presumption of causality and disclosure obligations. The works on the AI liability directive will likely revamp after the AI Act is finalized. Juan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chiara. So moving on, the G7 principles and code of conduct were issued at the end of October. And although these aren't legally binding, they are pretty similar for both developers and users of AI. And the G7 is hoping a lot of developers will be signing up to this. There is no particular definition of AI. Advanced AI systems are the most advanced AI systems, including most advanced foundation models and generative AI systems. And moving on to the next slide, just to give you a picture of the terms, you can see that I'm not going to read them out to you. They're easily available online. I've highlighted the ones that are most relevant to users as opposed to developers, particularly, of course, number 5, governance, which we will be covering shortly. But I did want to make the point that actually the line between developers and users can be blurry, because you could be using AI by procuring a third-party system, or you could be using a commercial or open source model and then fine-tuning it on your own data, in which case you might be a developer to some extent. So beware of that. You have to look at your individual AI uses. For some, you might be a pure user. For others, you might be a developer. If we go to the next slide, please. The UK AI Safety Summit is fairly well known. It brought a lot of countries together in November, and the Bletchley Declaration is one of the key outcomes of this summit. Now, the focus was on AI safety, and there's a lot of good words said in the declaration, but again, not legally binding. What is good is that a lot of countries signed this all across the world. There is focus on testing new models before they're released, but again, as I say, not necessarily legally binding at this stage. The UK and the US have both established their own AI safety institutes, which should be working together and with industry to try and move AI safety forward. I did want to mention that one good outcome of this summit is that quite a lot of big tech AI companies actually produced their own AI safety policies on the areas that you see on the left, like capabilities, scaling, red teaming, etc. So I mentioned that in case it's of practical use to you when you are looking at your own AI safety policies to see what these companies have done. If we can move on, please. Some of you might have heard about the UK Artificial Intelligence Regulation Bill that was introduced last week, which requires the Secretary of State to make regulations on various areas. Now, keep calm and carry on, don't panic, because this is actually a private member's bill. It was not introduced by the UK government. And statistically, over the last few years, maybe about 5% of private members' bills have gone through. So do not panic, as I say, this may not go through. There are quite a few issues with this bill. It is very broad because, for example, as well as wanting to appoint an AI authority, which seems unexceptionable, it wants every company, any business which develops, deploys, or uses AI to have an AI officer. And even though AI is newly trendy since ChatGPT, actually a lot of products and services do behind the scenes have AI. So it's like any business whatsoever is going to have an AI officer, which is great for employment statistics. But you know, that is one of the issues with this bill. And it also doesn't distinguish very well between those who are training AI and those who are using AI, and it covers issues about training data, about audits, about health warnings, which I won't go into because of the time issue and the fact that it may not go through. So with that, I will hand over to Simon on the governance front.
Thanks very much, Con, and thanks all. I think some really key takeaways there. US executive order, that is really moving the needle now in terms of what we're seeing around the expectations. Really important time in terms of development and finalisation of the EU AI Act, the leading global horizontal piece of regulation here, and lots of international coalescing around some global principles there that we'll touch on a bit further. Okay, now we'll move on to sort of looking at more of the meat of the session, looking at developing the AI governance programs and the various steps that we're recommending that clients move through. And we're going to start with Peter looking at starting with the AI strategy. Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And just a quick note on that global regulatory trend. I think the reason why we're seeing tension at the US level, trying to figure out, do we address these large language models, these large developers? Quan, to your point on the UK AI bill, which developers are going to be subject to it? There's a debate at the EU level. Is it generative AI? Do we include it? Do we not? The tension is that we're really only addressing the technology as we know it right now, which is the generative AI tools that are publicly available. But the trajectory of AI is that it's going to continue to evolve and eclipse human oversight and human intelligence. So when regulations are being drawn to specifically regulate people and companies, that will hit a ceiling eventually because it won't necessarily scale to address the future of the technology. So that's really the tension that we're seeing as a through line, is how do you regulate technology that's on a pathway to being self-regulating? And I don't think anybody has the answer yet, but that sort of gives you a sense of where there's a lot of tension, especially at the US level. From a governance standpoint, getting back to how do you actually address this problem, before even setting up a policy, a governance framework, you first have to start with strategy. You have to ask yourself, do we want to be using AI? Does it make sense for our business? Will it actually increase market share? What are the risks involved based on where we're positioned in the marketplace? And that decision really does need to be made at the strategic, at the board level for most organizations. And I'll give you an example of what this looks like. I was working with a large healthcare hospital education system in the US with a large board of directors. And the board was charged with developing whether they would like to use AI as an enterprise. And that's because the mission statement of the organization was to use technology to advanced healthcare. It was written right in the mission statement. So that gave the charge to the board of directors to then decide at each individual business unit level, what's the strategy around AI? And then management would go and execute and build the governance program that Simon and Jianji are going to dive further into. So that strategy level decision becomes incredibly important. And the only way you get to that strategy answer is if you map and understand what you're currently doing around AI and what you want to be doing around AI. And that mapping exercise, there's really no shortcut to get to that answer other than actually diving in with individual business units and asking the hard questions. What are you currently using from an AI standpoint? What type of tools? And what type of tools would advance your work? What would make your job easier? What type of operational or customer-facing tools are out there? That fact-gathering process, which is very similar to the fact-gathering process that we do on the data privacy side, data map, understand your data, have an inventory before you actually implement a governance program. It's equally applicable in the AI space. The wrinkle in AI, though, is that the use cases continue to evolve. Simon, you mentioned this at the beginning. The technology is evolving at such a rate that the use cases continue to evolve at such a rapid rate. And so it's not a static exercise, understanding the use cases and understanding the strategy. So as we talk about building a governance program throughout the back end of this webinar, the strategy piece is really a part of each decision-making process and continually to evolve and look at your strategy. Finally, and Quan, you raised this about this issue of, are you procuring AI from a vendor or are you developing it yourself, including tweaking open source models on your own data, and are you now tiptoeing into the developer space? That becomes a very important strategic decision, because if you are going to solely rely on third-party developed AI to further your strategy, the risk profile changes because you have less control over what the vendors and third parties are doing with those models. And I think, Simon, you're about to jump into starting with a principles-based framework and building out the governance program. One of those principles is visibility, transparency. The less you have control over the model, the less transparency you're going to have. So that strategic decision of we're going to go forward and chart our own path and develop our own AI versus we're going to start off relying on third parties, they carry with it different operational impacts. So big picture on strategy, it's an important discussion to have. I would try to avoid developing AI guidelines and policy in silos. You don't want the privacy team just taking it, or security, or the HR team leading it on HR tools. It really has to be holistic, and strategy decisions up front are going to save you a lot of time and effort on the back end. So Simon, with that, I'll toss it over to you, because I think once you've made your strategy decision, the next step is figuring out, well, how do I put the pieces together and start building that governance program?
That's great. Thanks very much, Peter. And that's exactly right. The core decisions need to be made around where and how and what AI is going to be deployed, but then how do you start to build the frameworks, the principles, the ethical values in which the organization is going to operate and deploy that technology. We've touched already on some of the potential risks that sit around the use of AI, and clearly there needs to be this set of developed framework to allow the business to operate with innovation on this new and evolving technology, but making sure that the risks are identified, mitigated, and managed. Now, one of the challenges that many organizations will be thinking about here, truly AI is a global technology. There are no territory and there are no boundaries that AI recognizes, and it will be used across businesses on a global basis. So given the short and overview we've already given in relation to the various regulatory and principle-based developments that are evolving on a global basis, how can you go about actually starting to create a framework that will manage both your strategic needs, but also some of those developing regulatory and legal requirements? Well, the benefit, the good news here is, looking at this at a holistic and global level, you do see a lot of alignment coming through in terms of key principles and requirements that are developing, both from a market perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. Indeed, Deloitte have done some analysis on this and looked at something in the region of about 1,600 pieces of policy developments or regulation on a global basis around the AI, and have found a large amount of alignment in relation to sort of key principles. And now, to bring this alive a little bit, if we skip on to the next slide, I can share some high-level analysis that we at Dentons have been doing around looking at some of the key frameworks, principles, regulations that have been developed. We've touched on some of these already during this session, but you'll see just from a very quick snapshot here in terms of some of the principles that will be very relevant across a lot of these, and how there's an ability, you can see already on a global basis, to start to develop an approach which coalesces around many of these principles, giving you very good coverage from both ethical principles, market principles, and regulatory principles. So some of these looking at such certainly on security and safety of systems, ensuring they're protected against cyber attack. Peter quite rightly touched on fairness and accountability and governance, making sure there's executive level oversight and accountability for these principles, these systems that are repeated. It is, however, important to make sure that you're sort of aware of the context in which these principles will apply to your business, so that they can be operationalized whenever you're developing the protocols that sit underneath them, and understanding where to focus your efforts. So fairness, for example, is generally around focusing on making sure there's no discriminatory or bias built into the system. If you're looking at deploying this heavily in an HR context, or in others that are in other contexts, social care context or social security context from a US perspective, where there's likely to be significant impact on an individual, clearly there needs to be more focus in your operational protocols, looking at ensuring that principle is brought to the fore. How do you look at ways in making sure that bias within data sets is reviewed? You look at developing further synthetic data to supplement those data sets, run other technologies or tools across the data set to identify underrepresented groups in the data set. Equally, however, if perhaps you're using AI for health and safety checks on industrial equipment or in engineering equipment, less relevance in terms of fairness, but clearly robustness and repeatability of the decisions and the testing is going to be very important from your regulatory perspective, from a health and safety perspective. That's just to call out or to bring to life a little bit more about why there's a need to, as Peter has outlined, understand where the use cases go, where the AI is going to be used, to allow those principles at a high level to then be made operational in respect of the relevant uses. If we can skip on to the next slide, Kwan's already made an excellent point about looking what's out there in the market. There is a lot of principles, guidelines, codes of practice, and private businesses having put out their own versions of this. Do look and learn and take what works for your business. However, one thing that is becoming an increasing challenge, and this is an effort that is needed, is looking at the practical requirements that are starting to come out from the various principles that we've talked about. Red teaming is an example we've already touched on. That's specifically called out in the executive order from the US. This is the idea of putting together a team to try and break your AI model. What is wrong with it? Where is the bias? Actually hardwiring that into certain development requirements. Watermarking, there's a lot of technical standards work being done in order to identify watermarking approaches to start protecting against disinformation risks. Peter again has already touched on the safety transparency reporting that's starting to come through, and there's logging requirements within the EU AI Act. So a need to start to identify where these operational day-to-day requirements are starting to come through from different regulation is also necessary. And then start to assess, is that something that does make sense for us on a universal or global basis, or are those requirements that we will manage on a regional case-by-case basis? We'll touch a little bit more on training and awareness, and that is such a fundamental part to bringing to life these operational requirements, as is the need to truly understand from a configuration and settings perspective how these AI tools work, and importantly, so making sure that there's a good awareness and training around those is also the core part of bringing these operational protocols to life. So I think if we move on to the next slide, I think we've got the second of our polls, and Jianji, if you want to lead us through this, and then I know you'll be taking up the baton after that. I think you're on mute, Jianji.
Thank you, Simon. So just you can see the poll. What are the main use cases within your organization? So software coding, content production, back office, HR resources, consumer-facing interactions. So you can do you can respond. We will give you a little bit of time. I don't know whether we could see the results.
Great. So we'll give everyone, Jianji, just a few more seconds to contribute. It's lovely to see everyone getting involved.
Thank you.
5, 4, 3, 2. Great. The last minute votes are coming in. 1. Excellent. And we'll close the poll and share the results.
Thank you. Okay, so interesting. So basically, it's mainly relates to back office efficiency, but also consumer-facing interaction. Together with a good, don't know, we are still reviewing the use cases. And by the way, we are doing we've done a survey this year. We'll be redoing a survey with our analysis also in the first quarter of next year. So starting from this, we've heard Peter, who was saying basically that there's the need of strong decisions at the board level. While Simon was saying there's a need of a lot of education throughout the organization. But how does this fit in within a governance structure? Basically, you need to know what you're doing. Peter was mentioning good mapping, but also you need a good structure. And for the structure to address this innovation, which is really transformational, obviously there's no one size fits all. But let's look at certain trends. We try to follow the first 5 letters. So A is accountability. So it's fundamental to set a structure to ensure accountability. And this means also determining who owns the C-suite accountability for both the execution of an AI strategy as well as compliance with the AI policies. And that obviously requires the top level buy-in that we've mentioned before. And for instance, we're already seeing some sector regulators, for instance, in Europe within the insurance and banking sector, that specifically requested an active involvement of the board, either directly with a direct involvement or with some forms of regular reporting. And whilst there's a lot of literature about the top management involvement, at the same time, there's also really wide consensus about ensuring a full understanding within the company at all levels about what does it mean AI, why AI is being used, what are obviously the risks, and that translates into policies and educations, but also by making all business areas responsible. For instance, identifying specific AI champions for each specific function within the company. And let's move to B as board. Why are we mentioning board? Because what we are seeing is that the evolution of AI working groups into a more formal internal AI board or AI council. And last week we've had we were in a panel with the European Union co-rapporteur to the AI Act, who was mentioning from an institutional perspective the idea of having an AI office, but open to the open society, gathering ideas through also some consultancy schemes, also from parties that are outside the public office. Likewise, this could be applied within the company, and what we are seeing in terms of trend is mixed teams, also to get an external perspective for blind spots. And so with additional advisory or supervisory boards, for instance, there's a well-known case of setting the office for the officer responsible for an AI together with an AI council with an interdisciplinary approach, because this board will have to manage the compliance, and we're talking about the broader compliance process. So we're all aware that the DPA is required when dealing with obviously AI from a data privacy perspective, but now what is required and will be required with the new regulation, the broader risk and conformity assessments. If you look at the latest Parliament proposal in the EU, we're also talking about a fundamental rights risk assessment. So it has to be truly cross-functional. And who, i.e., so including legal, tech, infosec, marketing, but who will lead this transformation? A lot say that the data privacy function is the right lead. But obviously, as we said, no one size fits all. It depends. But it is generally said that data privacy should at least be involved, because privacy officers and DPOs are used to managing projects involving deployment of new technologies and data. And they have familiarity with the roles of developers and deployers. They have experience in multi-jurisdictional projects, managing different stakeholders, so not just purely IT and legal. And they have an experience, most of all, in balancing fundamental human rights protections with new technologies. So very important to identify, as we said before, the key ethical principles and being able to balance them. A lot of companies already said the outlines of the principles. Let's see, for instance, the example of Microsoft, but there's a lot out there also in terms of standards, and including standards for responsible AI impact assessment. Then last but not least, this board should include different functions, different expertise, but should be diverse. And diversity in team is becoming increasingly relevant, because that would allow also to properly assess any bias, which is a fundamental point when assessing an AI system or using an AI system. And last but not least, evolution. There must be a proper change management within the structure, also to proper review the mechanism with the continuous monitoring, and which will be fundamental, as will also be required by the regulation. And I think now I would leave it up to you, Peter. We'll try to give a little bit of European flavor, and now let's go back to the US.
Thanks, Gianji. I think that structure that you just gave is a perfect jumping off point to then diving into, well, how do you actually operationalize and manage your AI program? How do you assess risk? actually at the granular level. And I think that survey that we just did is interesting because back office efficiencies was listed as the highest use case. So I want to use a back office efficiency tool as an example to walk you through some of these risk assessment concepts. Let's just take the Microsoft Office 365 Copilot tool that's now out there for people to use and examine. Well, that tool itself, to your point, Jianji, when you launch that tool on your enterprise Office 365 environment, it's not just a click and play, and now all of a sudden Copilot allows you to generate documents and be more efficient. There's a lot of data governance behind it. And when you look at the architecture and you actually sign up for the program, what happens is, as a user, you go into your Excel or you go into PowerPoint and you say, generate X, Y, and Z for me. Well, then the tool goes and actually accesses all the documents and information that the organization has given you permission to have access to in generating the response. So if you are an HR executive, should you have access to the accounting spreadsheet? And should the accounting executive have access to the HR file on employees? So in order to leverage that tool, you have to go in and identify users, access privileges. There's a lot of governance to go behind it. So when you're looking at rolling out new tools and assessing risk, one of the first things we recommend is start with a pilot. Start small, because a lot of tools nowadays, it takes a lot of work, a lot of consideration. So starting with a pilot is a good way to dip your toe into the pool, figure out the risk, figure out the right governance structure around AI. But even more important than starting with the pilot project is don't view risk, AI risk, in a vacuum. It is a risk assessment holistically across multiple business units and interests. And that's because, using that Copilot as an example, you can have HR risk, HR legal risk, you have accounting risk, you have potential trade secret and confidential information risk, you have IP protection, you have business and marketing uses, you have potentially board minutes that could be accessible. So you have to look at risk across the enterprise. And so that's why we always recommend with clients, don't reinvent the wheel on conducting these risk assessments. Use your existing risk assessment methodologies and tie in AI risk. So for example, a lot of the clients we're working with right now, when they are assessing new vendors to use AI, they're not creating a new AI risk assessment for vendors. They're using their existing cybersecurity risk assessment, which is pretty comprehensive for most organizations, and using that questionnaire, and then they're going into a deep dive on specific AI questions. How are you training your model? How are you governing your model? How do you have visibility? Do you have any model cards available? So they're asking those questions as part of an existing process. That's saving a lot of time and energy. But one important takeaway for everyone is, as you look to operationalize the principles that Simon outlined and the governance structure that Jianji outlined, is how at the very business unit level do you actually put this into operation? And the answer there is you have to create very specific operational guidelines and standards for each business unit. So for example, going back to that Microsoft Copilot example, if you are an HR department and you want to use Copilot to more efficiently synthesize work performance through a particular software, let's say you're using Workday to store work performance reviews, and you want to generate a report as to work performance, there needs to be a specific operating guideline for the HR department, permissions, acceptable uses, unacceptable uses of using that tool. I mean, it gets down to a very specific acceptable use case for each department. And that is where folks can start right now if you're looking at pilot projects in specific departments. Finally, diligence on vendors becomes a very important part of any AI risk assessment and management framework. And that is because you are only as protected, you are only as secure as your vendors are with regard to the models they're using. So for example, if you are going to be leveraging AI through a vendor instead of building your own, do you have visibility into how that model was developed? And I'll give you a quick example of how this actually played out in a real-time scenario. I was working with a client that was a retailer, and so they were very interested in direct marketing specific behavioral advertising, and they were working with a new vendor in the marketing space. And the new vendor in the marketing space did a demo of a new marketing tool that was very sophisticated in terms of generating insights, recommended ads, all based on artificial intelligence. And, everybody was very excited about the new tool, both marketing teams. And then, of course, as the AI lawyer, I came in and started asking questions. And I said, how do you ensure that the recommendations that are coming out of your AI tool do not result in discriminatory outcomes? What was the training data used to build the model? And the marketing provider actually couldn't answer the question. And so that was able to feed into the risk analysis of saying, you are now potentially carrying a risk, because if you start to deliver advertising and products based on a tool that you haven't built and you don't know how the tool was trained, the FTC in the US or the EEOC on the employment side could find that to be your responsibility as a company. So diligence on vendors is critical. And then finally, Simon, I know you're going to pick this up on training and awareness. Training your business folks on what AI is, what the risks are, and why it has to be a holistic team effort in managing the risk is really important, because AI literacy right now, we're starting to see a delta grow between adopters of AI and those who don't. So Simon, I'll toss it over to you to round out that issue on training and awareness.
Thanks very much, Peter. If we could just slap on to the last slide, if that's possible, please. Yeah, so this is really the kind of the last piece of the puzzle, really, from our perspective in terms of the governance. As Peter says, it's built on sort of training, but also really an expansion of the point that Jianji made around the need for constant evolution and review of systems. Now, really, there's actually technical and organizational reasons why building into this, your governance program, a need for a regular review of the operation and risks management process for tools. From a technical perspective, there are developments in the technology happening constantly. The latest versions being used, but also from an underlying data perspective, does the training data on which the model was either built or refined remain relevant? Has the world moved on significantly since the 18, 24, 36 months ago that the training was undertaken? Equally, as these tools continue to learn from running the various prompts and queries that will run through them, has there been some drift in the model? Has the model obtained continued to achieve the objectives to which it's set? So that so there is those technical reasons why there's a need for those reviews to be undertaken, as well as the sort of organizational points that we've touched on about the speed of development of technology in this space, the speed of business adoption and different use cases. For those two reasons, there's a need to make sure that there is a hardwired change management review process that's built into this. There's obviously decisions and considerations that need to be made in relation to how that review is undertaken and whether that's internal or what the sort of the model that's used around second line, third line of defenses. But I think one sort of really key takeaway that I would sort of leave this section with is, from all the discussions and conversations that I've had with clients and other contacts in this space, it's very clear that there's no technology silver bullet to address these various risks and governance issues that we've sort of identified. This is really a combination of both the cross-sectoral team that Jianji's touched on, looking at that strategic decision making that Peter's touched on, as well as then working on the technology side and building in this review process to make sure there is constant learning and constant development that is happening through that process. So building in that, hardwiring in that change management side to your program and governance, as Jianji mentioned, is really, really important. Now, I'm very conscious of time, so we'll skip on. And what we just wanted to do now, if we move on to the next slide, Jianji, I'll hand over to you. We really just wanted to make sure we know through a lot of information at you, particularly in the last 35 minutes or so. What are the sort of the key takeaways for you at looking at developing your governance programs, Jianji?
Thank you, Simon. 5 takeaways in 2 minutes. Then that's the effort. Okay, so carry out the mapping exercise, identify the principles, and we've heard from Quan there's wide variety of literature and principles available. I would say there's a bit of rush for identifying new principles, and make sure you align your AI use cases with your business strategy and objectives. This is really fundamental. You may also want to consider starting small in doing that, as Peter was saying before. Then identify your board, your cross-functional team, but cross-functional team, not just in terms of competence, but also in terms of diversity, if you want to prevent or help preventing certain bias. Then ensure and get structured to carry out broader assessments. Beyond, you may use the same methodology of DPIAs, but just shift towards the broader fundamental rights and security assessments. And we're talking about security and monitor and assess and test throughout the life cycle. That means, as we said before, vendor due diligence, review of vendor terms. You know, there are also new threats, for instance, the data mining, adversarial attacks. So it requires a lot of dynamism, and also in terms of the structure you want to provide. And most of all, as said by Simon before, internal education. So it needs to be explained why you're using AI and what are the implications, in terms not just of privacy, but also in terms of copyright. So obviously, policies are important, but you have to ensure that such policies are being understood and most of all implemented. Up to you.
Thanks very much, Gianji. And just so, thanks very much, everyone. That's really the bulk of the session. Just a couple of other resources or items that we wanted to draw your attention to for some wider support that you can get from Dentons in relation to AI. We've been through our own AI journey at Dentons, and particularly in the UK, we have launched our own AI tool, Fleet AI. This is built on ChatGPT, GPT-4 in a climate and secure environment. The data is not sort of brought back into the wider learning model. And this is a tool that we've developed internally, along with partners at some technology providers and collaboration with Microsoft. And we're using this certainly within the UK and UK, Ireland, and Middle East region at the minute for our lawyers to enhance the work that they're doing. We're also engaging with clients to look at how they can use this, from document summary, document automation, to enhance researching capabilities. So if you are interested in hearing more about that, both either from our own learning perspectives or indeed seeing an example or model, a demo of that, for further discussion, please do feel free to get in touch. A couple of examples there just to demonstrate it in real world. And if you skip on to the next slide, we also just wanted to highlight other resources that you're able to get from Dentons in relation to AI. Please do go and visit our Global Solutions Hub on dentons.com. There's a wealth of updates and thought leadership pieces from us from the last number of years, including previous surveys that Gianji referred to. And I'll give Peter, I think I gave you 30 seconds last night. I think I've probably given you 10 seconds today, maybe to quickly touch on the AI global governance white paper.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Simon. So we published a white paper this summer on the future of AI global governance. For anyone interested in this policy debate as to what the future of AI regulation may look like to address this trajectory of the technology and technology that's going to be governing itself, check out the white paper. We offer some proposals and some insights as to what that future governance framework looks like, and would love to chat with you if you have any questions. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much, Peter. I know we're at the top of the hour. My apologies that we didn't have the opportunity to get into any Q&A. If there are any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with any of the speakers on today's panel, or indeed your usual contact at Dentons. Please do take the opportunity to provide any feedback on this particular session. We're always keen to make sure that we're making these as specific and relevant for you as you need. And please do check out our upcoming webinars in the CX series. The details are on those, and how to sign up is available on the website. Thanks very much for joining, everyone.